Well, Professor Logan, you've talked a lot about the various impacts of work from home mandates. I'd love to pair in that factor with AI job displacement and the future of work. How should we all think about the ways in which both work from home mandates and AI job displacement will affect the future outlook of labor in the country?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I think that it's one that there's maybe not a really great answer to at the moment. Just to step back, there's always been fears that new technologies will destroy jobs and displace workers. I mean, that's, if you look back to the Industrial Revolution, the so-called Luddites often get a bad rap. The Luddites weren't Luddites in a way. They weren't anti-technology, but they wanted to have more control over the technology themselves. So, but yes, you can go and look at eras of mass production, of Fordism, of automation, of digitalization, up to the present time, and it's so far almost entirely been true that new technology has created more jobs than it has destroyed. Now, of course, some jobs are destroyed, but new jobs are created. And we often, don't know what these new jobs, we know the kinds of skills that people will require, broadly speaking, to make them employable. But we don't actually know the jobs. We can't always imagine the jobs. And so if you think back, maybe like 10 or 15 years, there was a lot of fear that, automation was going to wipe out millions of jobs, the kinds of jobs that millions of Americans still do. So if you look at things like cashier's jobs, it's surprising that, 3 or 4 million people in this country, their occupational classification is a cashier. And long-distance trucking. Long-distance trucking is, in fact, the most common job in a lot of states. More people do that one job than any other single job in a lot of states in the U.S. And so there was a fear that, with self-checkout technology and, grab-and-go technology, that cashiers' jobs would be totally wiped out. And with self-driving technology, that long-distance truckers' jobs would be totally wiped out. And it hasn't happened. It's not to say that it might not still happen, but, often the fears are kind of overblown. And it's complicated. You've got to look at it in a sort of case-by-case basis. Why hasn't even sort of self-checkout in supermarkets taken off to the extent that was predicted? Now, personally, I love self-checkout, and I've been using it. I go back and forward. I lived in London for 10 years. Self-checkout was everywhere. I thought, great. I'm very impatient, so I don't have to wait in line. Just go to the self-checkout, and then I come back to the US, and it's not very common. Is, as you know, becoming far more common, especially somewhere like San Francisco. But part of the reason for the slow adoption of self-checkout in the US is actually just a cultural thing, that American customers have been far slower to embrace the technology is there, but they just don't like it. And whereas in Europe and particularly in Asia, it has been in place and it's far more common. And so, but it does, it does displace people. But you need other kinds of jobs. Obviously, you need people who understand, how to fix the tech, how to train people on the use of the technology. These are, the fewer jobs than there were cashiers. But again, a lot of the countries have been sort of most advanced adopting the technology like that, place a lot of emphasis, government programs and private public partnerships on employability. They don't care that people lose their jobs. I mean, they want to be innovative. They want to be technologically advanced. And they want firms to be able to hire and fire and be nimble and to be able to pivot. But they recognize that that's not going to work if the people who are displaced just end up in the scrap heap, or they believe that they're going to end up in the scrap heap. This sort of, it's often, in Nordic countries in Northern Europe referred to as, or 25 years ago was referred to as flex security, that the government was allowing the private sector maximum flexibility, but combining that with security for workers, that we will train you to find different jobs. And, it has worked quite well for a number of years in a lot of countries in Northern Europe. I mean, it's in recent years come under a lot of strain. But so the fear, of course, is that we live in a country here where for people who don't succeed in the job markets, the consequences can be quite dire. Most Americans get their health insurance through their job, unless you're very old or very poor. You can, of course, you get supplementary health insurance through government programs, but still, most people get it through their job. So if you lose your job, you also lose your health insurance. And that can be catastrophic, obviously. That's not true in most European countries because the government provides the health insurance. So, you have to think about it in terms of well, if the technology displaces people, then what happens? What happens to those people? The self-driving technology, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but I was interested to think, what if the predictions are correct? I mean, what if millions of long-haul truckers really are going to be eliminated over the next 5 to 10 years? And since I started to read all of that literature about the rise of the robots, it hasn't happened to nearly the extent that people feared that it might. Obviously in San Francisco, we have Waymo taxis, and, we do have a lot of quite self-driving technology, and the technology is getting better. Now, with AI, obviously, it is totally different,
Yeah, and earlier in your answer, you mentioned a pretty standard economic principle in that when technological advances occur, they typically tend to result in an increase in productivity, although typically there is a short period of disruption where people experience a lot of hurt and economic loss. What's your sense of the ways in which sort of governments are trying to address that short-term disruption that we're anticipating to occur as a consequence of AI advancement? Historically, what kinds of, say, government aid or approaches as a labor participant have typically mitigated the loss that occurs in those periods?
So, it's a really good question, a really interesting question. Again, one that I'm not sure there's a very clear answer to yet. Again, a lot of governments, particularly in Europe, they have a culture where there's much more government intervention in the economy. We talk about regulations in this country as being a sort of, a lot of people talk about them as being an obstacle to innovation. And it's true. If you have dumb regulations, it can be an obstacle to innovations. But in Europe, they have a lot more regulation. But for the most part, they try to make it smart regulation. They try to make it, regulation that protects consumers and regulation that protects people at work, but doesn't interfere with innovation and doesn't interfere with having a sort of dynamic job creating economy. But it's a balance. So again, with AI, governments in many European countries are much more involved in the conversation, I think, directly. Here, I think, this was one of the big sort of fissures between the tech industry and the Biden administration. And you could say the same over crypto as well. There was a feeling that the Biden administration wanted too much regulation. In terms of how many companies would be allowed into the field, how much would they be regulated, and the industry sort of said, no, that's not how it works. I mean, you have to take a much more hands-off approach, for these industries. If you want the United States to be the global center, if you want San Francisco and the Bay Area to be the crypto or the AI center of the universe, you can't do it that way. That's a discussion we can have. But so the impact on jobs, I genuinely think it's still quite unclear. And obviously it depends if AI and AGI, it can be used to augment, people's jobs, or whether or not is used to replace them, And even in big tech centers like San Francisco and Boston, we don't know what the disruptive potential, I think, of AI will be. It's something, as you said, it could create, lots of new jobs and, create lots of new wealth and innovation, or, it could put a lot of people out of work. And it's not really clear, what it's going to be. But there is this debate again, I sort of study labor issues, and it's something that, governments in Europe and, big labor organizations that represent large numbers of workers are saying, this cannot be exclusively controlled by the tech industry. We need to have a voice in this. AI needs to work for workers, so to speak. And again, we see this starting to emerge as a really important issue of discussion and negotiation in labor. And I'll use, there's many examples I could use. And again, it's one of these topics that reporters want to talk to me a lot about. But during the Hollywood strike in California last year, both the writers' strike, I think started in, maybe it was in 2023 it started. That's the thing with COVID, all the years still kind of merge into one another. Anyway, there was a very, months and months long writer's strike, and then the Screen Actors Guild also joined them in strike. And eventually, they were also on strike for many months, but they both got a settlement that they thought was very good. And it was a very good settlement. The problem Hollywood as an industry has is a lot of jobs are leaving Southern California, both, for other parts of the US, for Canada, for, lots of other countries. And so the number of jobs employed, a number of people employed in Southern California. But negotiations over AI was a very important part of that labor dispute.
Yeah, I absolutely love the cultural distinctions you've been drawing, especially between European and American labor. I think it gets to the complexities that surround sort of the impacts of AI job displacement. Mm-hmm. Perhaps, and this is sort of my personal assumption, the American workforce, and you can kind of infer this by virtue of the elected officials they elect, tend to just be a bit more culturally nimble as far as how they would like to carry on with their jobs and what degree of change they're comfortable with. Mm-hmm. As it pertains to their job responsibilities, right, or maybe just industries they work in.
Yeah.
Do you think that might be a big factor in the way AI job displacement globally plays out? There's certain pockets, economic pockets of labor that are much more apt to evolve alongside AI, and others right, where there might be a lot more issues with how they might want AI to be regulated and mm-hmm, how well they're going to be able to shift.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Obviously, one of the factors... so, income inequality, it's a very big topic in its own right. But, income inequality has grown globally. But in the United States, there's been huge growth in income inequality in the last 3-4 decades. And it's to do with a whole number of different reasons. I mean, there's not one thing. It's to do with globalization and deindustrialization. And the decline of unions. There's economists at Princeton and Berkeley who are good friends who have published a whole series of papers saying that, decline of unions in the US probably contributes to between a quarter and a third of the income inequality we've seen. But, technological innovation, has created, has exacerbated income inequality. And, without sort of making it too simplistic, the workforce is more and more in the US being divided into people who work with their minds and people who work with their bodies, and the middle is disappearing. So, what I mean by that, people know this, of course, but, you've had the creation of, a significant number, but, relatively small number of very high-paid, high-skilled jobs at the top end of the labor market, particularly in the tech industry. And then you've had the creation of millions and millions of jobs that are low-wage jobs, that are far more precarious jobs. People working as, gig workers, independent contractors, working in low-wage occupations. I mean, if you look at the industries that are growing, people think, well, healthcare is growing, like dramatic, continuing to grow at a really, significant pace. And, people think, well, that's a good thing. Healthcare jobs are good jobs. But the jobs that are growing the most in the healthcare industry are things like nursing homes and home health care. They're very low-paid jobs, and so we've had a lot of growth at that end of the labor market. And so, the more sophisticated the technology becomes, the likelihood is that it will cause even greater income inequality by those, who work with the technology, who understand the technology, who are, benefiting from the introduction of new technologies, and those who are kind of left behind. And, sometimes it sort of plays out in ways that are sort of unexpected. I mean, this is not the best example, but, technology for the most part is a great thing. I'm all in favor of you. And, there are exceptions. I could make a case that social media as a whole has not been a great invention for society. But the introduction of technology in, medical fields and a whole, number of the, unbelievable advances. It's just been great. But when you look at how people's individual jobs or occupations are impacted by new technologies, it's not always the way you think. So if you think like, a job like warehouse and logistics, and, I'm thinking here like, obviously one of the companies that grew the most, in fact, I think the company that grew the most during the pandemic was Amazon. Hired hundreds of thousands of new workers and became, the second largest private sector employer only after Walmart. So you think, well, how do Amazon warehouses compare with the industry norm? Amazon warehouses are very technologically advanced. Amazon has really good technology. It was the first to introduce, a lot of Kiva, these robotic, I've been in an Amazon warehouse. But what that has meant for the workers is actually that the jobs that are left for the workers are less skilled than they would have been otherwise. And, there's a controversy over things like injury rates. But, there's a lot of people out there who say injury rates are higher in Amazon warehouses than, tends to be for them. But Amazon would dispute that or, say that, well, it's more complicated than that. But nonetheless, so this is like, the most technologically advanced player in the industry. But for the workers, it means having less skilled jobs and maybe worse jobs. And say, we can debate that. So, yes, with any new technologies, but, just because of that we don't know exactly what the impact of AI and AGI is going to be, and that the technology is improving so quickly, and its disruptive potential is so much greater than, most of the technologies that we've been sort of thinking about in recent years.